Hello, welcome to our continuing devotional through the book of 1 Thessalonians. Today we're starting in chapter 2, starting in verse 1, where the Apostle Paul is kind of reviewing the history of him and his partners' first contact with the Thessalonians and how God worked through them and how that gave the Thessalonians insight into the character and the commitment and the heart of the Apostle Paul and his partners. So he says in verse 2, or chapter 2, verse 1, he says this: "For you yourself know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain." So he says, you are personal witnesses that when we came to you, our ministry was not a failure. It was not in vain. It was not empty. It was not useless. And then he goes on to say in verse 2, "But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." He says, even though our previous visit to Philippi, which was right before they visited Thessalonica, he goes, we were attacked, we were persecuted, we were thrown in jail. You probably remember that incident with the Philippian jailer. He goes, even though we knew the cost of being faithful to Christ, we knew the cost of being public and faithful to Christ, and that resulted us in suffering for us. Verse 2, that resulted us being shamefully treated. That didn't stop us when we got to you. We didn't tone down the message. We didn't change the message. We didn't say, you know what, let's be a little bit, let's whisper the gospel. He gets no. He says in verse 2, we had boldness in our God, which is exactly what you and I should have in this culture, which is now hostile to the true faith and shamefully treats those who are faithful. But like Paul, we should be able to say, we had boldness in our God to declare to the world, to you, the gospel of God, even in the midst, as verse 2 says, of much conflict. Hopefully that's true of you and I. That, you know what, part of the reality of our Christian life is we know, and we've experienced, some of us, that being faithful to God does not win you a lot of applause or friends. Sometimes it puts a big bullseye right in the middle of your chest. It makes you the subject of verbal attacks. Sometimes there's financial costs, there's social rejection. You lose friends, you lose family over it. You're often misunderstood, you're falsely accused, you're slandered. But in spite of all of that, God says, be bold in God to declare what is true, even in the midst of much conflict. I hope that you and I could say what Paul said here, that when we are out in the world, we're not ashamed. We're not letting fear control us. We're not letting previous experiences of hostility or rejection impact us, but rather empowered and emboldened by the Holy Spirit, we speak the truth in love always, but we speak the truth even in the midst, as verse 2 says, of much conflict. I hope you're doing that in your workplaces, in your family, in your neighborhood, in your home, that fear does not dominate and keep you silent, but rather faithfulness to God encourages boldness for God in speaking the truth. Have a blessed day.